Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. In the aftermath of Chairman Mao Zedong's disastrous personality cult, Chinese paramount leader Deng Xiaoping recognized the dangers of totalitarian dictatorship. In the early 1980s, Deng set about establishing a system that relied on competent governance, co-opting the elite and consensus rule at the top. China was still an autocracy, but it incorporated and empowered enough interest groups to provide basic political stability and stellar economic growth, with just one big exception in 1989. That system, which has served China so well for decades, has now been swept away. On Sunday, the Communist Party announced it would remove term limits on the presidency, allowing President Xi Jinping to rule for life if he wants. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze what impact the move will have on China, the region and the world. Joining me on the program today are Suresh K. Goel, former ambassador, Professor M.D. Nalapat, Editorial Director of ITV Media, Professor B.R. Deepak, Center for Chinese Studies, JNU, and Jabin Jacob, Senior Researcher, Institute of Chinese Studies. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Nalapat, I'd like to begin with you. Of course, this was bound to happen, wasn't it? Because right from the beginning, during Xi Jinping's first term, he was named the core leader of the party, and more recently in October 2017, in fact, we saw his rise to power as well. So this was many years in the making.
Well, actually, I was expecting Xi Jinping to be made the chairman of the party, the second chairman of the party after Mao Zedong, after his second five-year term ended. I was not really expecting a situation in which there would be an end of term limits, because as you very correctly said, that system has served the Chinese party very well. It served China very well. So it's certainly a departure from Deng Xiaoping's thought. And we are really going back to Mao's thought. Because if you remember, Mao had a very, if I may say so, some people call it aggressive, others will take a strong policy. He had a very assertive policy regarding China. And Deng Xiaoping had a very conciliatory policy regarding China. He always spoke very softly and tried to ensure that the Chinese were not seen as an aggressive power. After 79, frankly, they've not really got involved in any kind of war. Mao was very aggressive, and he aggressively promoted Chinese interests. He was not afraid to go to war when necessary. And I think Xi Jinping is now more in the Mao Zedong mindset. So that obviously has got certain implications for the rest of the world.
Indeed. We'll get into the implications for the rest of the world in just a bit. But before that, let's try and understand the process that was followed by the Chinese Communist Party before Sunday. I think B.R. Deepak, you'd be apt to tell us what exactly was the process followed before this Sunday.
Yeah, basically, it was very clear. You mentioned the last party Congress, and when the successor was not anointed, it was a case that it is going to happen. And then if you analyze the early this year, in fact it was deliberated inside the party, and when they announced, when the notification was made, it was only the endorsement of the Xi Jinping thought and the establishment of the supervisory commission. These two important things, and then this amendment of the constitution, it was held back. I mean the term, the 2 years terms. I think there are two things behind it. One is if you see the power structure, president doesn't mean anything. It's just a rubber stamp. He doesn't have any authority. He doesn't wield the gun. PLA doesn't report to him. He doesn't appoint the state council ministers, so on and so forth. And I think it is primarily because one, they think that it is China's moment, as Xi Jinping has rolled out the blueprint, for 35 and then to 2050. And more importantly, I think it is to accommodate his buddy Wang Qishan, and who has been instrumental, in anti-corruption campaign. And he would be, in fact, it would be endorsed in this the coming two sessions, and he would be made vice president. So president and vice president both have been, it have been the term has been the 2 years terms consecutive 2 years have been done away with. So we will see Wang Qishan being appointed as the vice president, and maybe second point is Xi Jinping would be assuming greater powers. I mean, the president
No,
and
when
vice
you,
president.
when you say greater powers, what do you mean by greater powers? Because, his powers at the moment seem to be unparalleled.
No, I mean the president would be given more powers. I think China is moving in that direction. Or Professor Nalapat said that, the chairman. So maybe, he ultimately would be anointed as the chairman.
Sure. Okay, let me bring in Jabin Jacob now. Jabin Jacob, why was the two-term rule done away with in the first place?
I think what is happening is the Communist Party of China is trying to create a precedent for Xi Jinping to get into a third term as party general secretary. As Professor Deepak, the position of the general secretary of the Communist Party is the most powerful position. After that, chairman of the PLA, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and then the president of the PRC. So here what we have is the Communist Party of China suggesting or proposing an amendment to the constitution, not of the party itself, but of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, the state constitution. And mind you, this is basically, in March, the equivalent of China's parliament will meet for its annual meetings. And the National People's Congress, which is like the Lok Sabha in India, will be expected to sort of rubber stamp this decision of the Communist Party of China. So essentially, if there are no term limits for the president of China, why should there be term limits for the general secretary? The norm has been so far for the last couple of decades that the general secretary of the party will also serve only 2 terms. Now, if this precedent has been set, it is quite possible by the next party congress in 2022. Before that, the 2-term norm can also be ignored for the general secretary.
Sure. Okay.
That really is the source of power for Xi Jinping.
All right. Ambassador, what does all of this mean for China?
All right. Now, I'm not a scholar, Frank. I'm a practitioner. I've seen how Chinese politics has evolved over a period of time since 1978. That is a year when I joined the service and I began to learn Chinese language in 1980. I'm not a scholar, but I'm a practitioner. And my take is going to be slightly different from what I have heard so far. My take is that when Deng Xiaoping became the party chair, the party general secretary, he became the president and he came over, he began the process of reform. Clearly, those reforms were meant for the economic liberalization of China. He had to move China on a faster economic growth path, which needed the Western countries to come and invest in China in all kinds of industries. Therefore, the facade of party liberalism was created by creating the term limitations and so on and so forth. But the party dictatorship continued. The party maintained its control over the politics in China. Nobody could actually move against the party during that period. In any case, Deng Xiaoping knew that he probably will not be able to continue beyond 2 terms. So for him, it didn't really matter at all, really. So that happened. 1989, the Tiananmen was interpreted by the Western countries as pro-democracy movement. There was never any democracy in China. There will never be any democracy in China. There will be economic liberalism because they needed the reforms. The 1989 was basically an attempt by the academics to get a greater share in the power structures in the party and in the society. Now we come to Xi Jinping. In between, you have Hu Jintao, etc., etc. They all continued. Xi Jinping is a very strong, very assertive party leader, clearly. And he is making his presence, he is making his thoughts felt in the party constitution, in the party circle. But the fact is that he is now having got really China as the leading economy, where China is now dictating terms to the world in terms of both the economic and the strategic needs and the strategic equations. I think now a time has come when China really will not be bothered about what the Western countries think about the political liberalism in the country. They know very well that to keep China together, the control of party is important. And the control of party means strong party leadership.
Okay.
And that is where Xi Jinping is. Just one more point. I think basically having announced that yes, now the party structures are going to be in command of the politics here, he will continue with the economic reform progress, the economic liberalism as it is. I don't think there is going to be any change in this. But I think what is going to happen is really that Xi Jinping is going to make sure the corruption, etc., all that, okay, will go on, but he will make sure that nobody in the party says a single thing which militates against his control.
Sure. You know, Mr. Nalapat, could this go wrong for Xi Jinping? Because if something goes wrong with the economy, or if we see some kind of, foreign policy going sour, the blame is solely going to be on Xi Jinping now going forward.
Well, I'd like to point out that a lot of issues went, in your terminology, wrong during Mao Zedong's time. It didn't really affect Mao Zedong's popularity, even during massive famine and massive problems with industrialization. Remember, China was much poorer than India in those days. Overall, the Chinese people still clustered around him because of the fear that they had of once again breaking up into warlordism, of once again becoming, subservient to outside powers. The Chinese are a very proud people, and they had about a century and a half of subservience to outside powers, and that was enough to really make them very upset about that, to the extent that, in my view, they'll be willing to forgive lapses in a leader, provided they believe that leader is ensuring that China is, in a sense, the middle kingdom, the core of the world.
Absolutely.
And I think that is what Xi Jinping is saying. The Belt and Road project is frankly the project which says, look, we are the center of the world once again. We are the core of the world economy. And the facts are bearing him out. They are the core of the world economy. The only question regarding the West that you're asking, frankly, I do not really see a conflict between the West and China, for the simple reason that the two are so invested and embedded in each other, it will destroy both. So just as between the Soviet Union and America, there was no real major conflict because both would destroy each other if there was a conflict. Today, economically, the West and China will destroy each other if there's a military conflict between them.
Sure.
When India comes forward.
Sure. We'll talk about India in just a bit. But before that, Professor Deepak, is it really a sign of power or is it really a sign of weakness? Because I asked this question because Xi Jinping seems to be reluctant to allow the second rung to come up in the fear of, developing a political rival.
I think I endorse, the point of both the panelists, including Jabin, So one, again, I will reiterate that Xi Jinping believes, or he has made the Chinese people to believe that this is the moment for China. And Xi Jinping has a blueprint for that, So one, he would like to realize the Chinese dream as long as he's there, the dream of the rejuvenation of China. And for that, for that, there is a blueprint, and he would like China to eradicate poverty by 2020, totally, and by 2035, make the socialist modernization to happen in China, and by 2050 to make China into a moderately developed society. So that is Xi Jinping's idea for Chinese rejuvenation and putting China at the center stage of the world. And of course, OBR could be seen as an instrument, in that. So this is one thing. And I think another thing is which is equally important is the way he has initiated this, you can say, anti-corruption campaign inside China, by way of which he has silenced all his detractors. So there is no opposition. You see, they are having these two sessions starting from 3rd March, NPC and CPPCC, and the deputies to these sessions, around 3,000 deputies, most of them, they are the first timers, and they are all Xi Jinping's people. And we can say that they are either Fujian faction or Zhejiang faction, where Xi Jinping has served. And I think another thing which I would like to emphasize is the General Secretary, of the Communist Party of China. He is not bound to step down according to the party constitution. And that is why, if he desired, he could have continued even without changing these 2 consecutive terms. But I think it is this movement of China, it is this socialist modernization which they want to achieve, and the rejuvenation of China, which is extremely important. And I think another issue with this is Xi Jinping's thought. He believes that if he steps down, the thought of Xi Jinping, it would also go away. It would be diluted, as has been diluted the thought of Hu Jintao, scientific outlook, as well as 3 representatives. If you see, when China mentions it right now in their writings, there is nowhere mentioned it is 3 representatives are propounded by Jiang Zemin, and scientific outlook by Hu Jintao.
Yeah.
But Xi Jinping's thought is always there. And I think another point which is equally important is the 3 things. One is the path, so-called the social the development path with the socialism with Chinese characteristics, and second, the theories of it. And theories, of course, Xi Jinping's thought becomes most important. It takes precedent. And third, the institutions, and which he has changed at will, and I think will continue to change this further.
Indeed, indeed. Jabin Jacob, B.R. Deepak was raising the point about how there is no real opposition to Xi Jinping within the Communist Party in China. Is that going to lead to some kind of instability in the years to come as the second rung tries to jockey for power?
Look, let me try and answer that question, the previous question you asked, whether this is a sign of strength or of weakness. I think this is, any leader who finds it necessary to enshrine his own thought in the constitution, to actually put down in words what needs to be done to remove term limits, I think it's a sign of weakness. It actually shows that all is not well within the Chinese system. In terms of jockeying for power, I think that is the least of the Communist Party of China's problems. The reference was made before to the fact that democracy will not come to China, or democracy will not be acceptable in China. But if you look at Chinese social media, look at how Chinese people are already reacting to this news of Xi being, possibly leader for life and so on. I think there's a great deal of sarcasm, there's a great deal of criticism, hidden criticism, of course, but implied criticism. And so I think as long as the Communist Party of China cannot really get the absolute loyalty of its people, whereas people are questioning, China today is very different from Mao's China. So it's not as if Chinese people do not have sources of information from outside of China, which tells them what the rest of the world looks like, what the rest of the world is doing, it's not as if Chinese people do not have the ability to think for themselves exactly what they want or what is falling short in their own country. Mm-hmm. So I think as long as that remains, that spirit, that reality is that what it is, no matter how much the Communist Party of China tries to centralize power in the hands of one man, it's always going to be a tight walk for the leader in charge.
All right.
And this means that Xi Jinping lays himself open for criticism for anything that goes wrong.
All right, let's take the discussion forward now, of course, and talk about what this development means for India, Ambassador.
Well, I wanted to very briefly comment on what was being discussed before, and I would really like to say that as far as the Chinese systems are concerned, we should not fall in the trap of Kissingerian thought when he thought that the economic reforms, economic progress will lead to greater democracy in China. It didn't happen. Chinese are far more disciplined than that, really. Coming to the idea of India, really, I think we need to look at really not in terms of Xi Jinping. What we need to look at really is where China is going to be. And what I see happening is that over the next decade, China is going to continue to rise and rise and rise. Asymmetry between India and China is going to continue to grow further beyond.
Asymmetry is what you're saying. There is no scope for convergence?
I don't think so. The way, even if you look at the growth rate that we have at the moment and with China's growth rate, I think it will take more than 50 years to come closer to convergence. The asymmetry is going to continue to grow, at least economically. Militarily, one is very, very difficult to say. So what we are going to see really is an ascendant China, a China with a strong leader who is single-minded in determination to put China by 2050 on the world map as the top country, as the #1 country. India is in the direct neighborhood. We have had problems, we have confrontation. India will not be a challenge for China anymore, but India will be an irritant for China because of its own global thing. So we will need to be wary of what China is. We will need to be very careful of about what our China policies are. I think the way I look at it is that we will have to accept China on our doorstep as a major power and work in accordance with that fact.
Okay.
That's it.
Professor, do you concur? Do you believe that, India needs to change its strategy with how we deal with China going forward now that we know Xi Jinping is here to stay for some time at least?
Well, I'd like to say that very definitely we do need changes in the strategy that we've been following for several decades, because as our foreign policy expert and senior diplomat correctly says, this has not really worked very well for us. Now, the point is that so far as the Communist Party is concerned, the party regards itself as a state, and the ideology is that the state is the country, and therefore, if the Communist Party is in trouble, the country is in trouble. So that identity they have been trying to create ever since 1949 in the minds of the people, and there is a genuine fear of chaos, etc., in the minds of the Chinese people. There's no doubt that today people in China are, in a sense, much more open to outside influence, etc. But let me remind you that in several American campuses, American professors have been astonished by the degree of Chinese nationalism by Chinese students on the campus. And the Chinese students are, for example, on this issue of Taiwan, for example, in Australia, people, Taiwanese who say we are Taiwanese, we are not Chinese, are thrown out of companies where Chinese are managers. So there is a very strong feeling in that. And I think what Xi Jinping is relying on is that very strong sense of Han nationalism. And he's saying that, look, if you want to strengthen yourself, I am the person. You need to strengthen the party. And the party can only be strengthened by a single core led by a single person. Now, please understand one thing. There is a fear in the Communist Party that, like you had color revolutions taking place in Eastern Europe, you had this Arab Spring taking place. There is a fear that there is an organized effort from outside to weaken the Communist Party and weaken communist rule. And that is creating grounds for this kind of centralization.
Indeed. PR Deepak, very quickly, what does this development mean for the region as Washington starts to withdraw from Asia?
I think there is no doubt about it, as China asserts itself and as it becomes muscular economically, we see the role of the great powers in the region, including India, shrinking. The space is shrinking, there is no doubt about it. And I think as far as India is concerned, it really has to, put it acts together. In fact, recently I was in China and I made a statement during the Global Times annual conference. And it was that, China looks down upon India and India doesn't think big about China. I think the premise for both the statement is very wrong. I think we really need to look into that, and that there could be convergences provided that, we put our act together and we really think in terms of our national interest as far as our security interest in the long term.
All right. Jabin, Jacob, what's the way forward for India and China, really?
I think the first point we have to keep in mind is that China's rise is not set in stone. There are many problems that China faces internally. While we are all focused on what China is doing externally, its aggressive actions in the South China Sea, it's building bases around Asia and so on. The point of the matter is that for Xi Jinping himself and the Communist Party itself, the first and primary concern is stability at home.
Right.
And this is not entirely assured at all times for the Communist Party leadership.
All right, I've got limited time on the program. Very quick closing comment, Ambassador.
Well, I think we are in for very interesting times. And I would really say that, yes, there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of where it's all going to go. But one thing is certain, that we are really going to see China with a strong party dictatorship, with a liberal economy. Now, that's the recipe for really a lot of interesting confrontations will take place.
Okay, unfortunately, I'm out of time on the program today. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, well, we have to deal with a more assertive China going forward, and we really need to be wary of the red dragon, is what our panelists are saying here. Remains to be seen, of course, what the Indian government does in the near future to deal with China. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.